morning, everyone. I'm Rana May Serdan, taking up Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in English. My topic is all about mechanism of language acquisition. So let's start. Before let's proceed to the mechanism of language acquisition, let's know first the meaning of language acquisition. So what is language acquisition? Language acquisition is the process by which humans acquire the capacity to perceive and comprehend language. In other words, gain the ability to be aware of language and to understand it, as well as to produce and use words and sentences to communicate. Language acquisition involves structures, rules, and representation. The capacity to successfully use language requires one to acquire a range of tools including phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and an extensive vocabulary. Language can be vocalized as in speech or manual as a sign. Human language capacity is represented in the brain. Even though human language capacity is finite, one can say and understand an infinite number of sentences, which is based on syntactic principle called recursion. So now let's proceed to the mechanism of language acquisition. In order to learn language, a child must have able a rich representational system and flexible ways of deciding between representations. The child framework must be rich enough to enable him to represent the intricate set of rules, positional patterns, cues, and conditions that constitute the grammar of any possible natural language. Since the child has no idea at the outset which of the many possible natural language structure he will need to learn, his approach to language learning must be extremely flexible. Language is extremely complex. Children before 5 already know the complex system that make up the grammar of a language: syntactic, phonological, morphological, semantic, and pragmatic rules of grammar. Wherein the syntactic is the syntax refers to the rules used to combine words to make a sentences. Syntactic development is the way children learn these rules. Syntactic development is measured using MLU or mean length of utterance, which is basically the average length of a child's sentence. This increases as the child gets older. According to Jean Berko, Gleason's book, The Development of Language, kids go through 5 stages of syntactic development, which were identified by Roger Brown in 1973. Children automatically develop syntactic rules without explicit instruction. They learn it simply by listening to others speak around them. Next is the phonological. Phonological development refers to how children learn to organize sounds into meaning or language phonology during their stage of growth. Sounds is at the beginning of language learning. Children have to learn to distinguish different sounds and to segment the speech stream they are exposed to into units, eventually meaningful units, in order to acquire words and sentences. One reason that speech segmentation is challenging is that unlike between the printed words, no spaces occur between spoken words. Thus, if an infant hears the sound sequence, "this is a cup," they have to learn to segment this stream into the distinct units, "this," "is," "a," and "cup." Once cup is able to be extracted from the speech stream, the child has to assign a meaning to this word. Furthermore, the child has to be able to distinguish the sequence cup from cup in order to learn that these are two distinct words with different meanings. Finally, the child has to learn to produce these words. The acquisition of native language phonology begins in the womb and isn't completely adult-like until the teenage years. Perceptual abilities such as being able to segment "this is a cup" into 4 individual individual words units usually precede production and thus aid the development of words speech production. Next is morphological. Morphology refers to the structure and construction of words. Morphology skills require an understanding and use of the appropriate structure of a word, such as a word roots, prefixes, and affixes, called morphemes. Strong knowledge of grammatical morphemes, such as use of ing for a present progressive verb, s to indicate a plural form, and correct use of verb tense is necessary in order to have well-developed morphology skills. Syntax refers to the rules of words order and word combination in order to form phrases and sentences. In children, morphological variables such as morpheme, frequency, and morphological awareness, the ability to manipulate morphemes, have been associated with word reading and spelling, reading comprehension, and vocabulary size. Semantic and pragmatic rules of grammar. Semantics, most generally, is about the meaning of sentences. Someone who studies semantics is interested in words and what real-world object or concept those words denote or point to. Pragmatics is an even broader field that studies how the context of a sentence contributes to meaning. For example, someone shouting fire has a very different meaning if they are in charge of a 7-gun salute than it does if they are sitting in a crowded movie theater. Pragmatic development highlights children's motivation to acquire language in the first place, as it serves different purposes and functions. Pragmatics aren't acquired immediately, nor does it take a short period of time for a child to acquire them. This process is ongoing until the age of approximately 10 years. If you have a child with a developmental or speech delay, you may have heard the term pragmatics. It refers to the use of language in the social setting, with friends, at school, and at home. Often, it is not enough that the child learns grammar and vocabulary in order to communicate. He also needs to understand how these words come together in a social language. Child struggling with pragmatics may use few words to express himself or seem disorganized in the way he speaks. He may have a hard time taking turns in conversation or make inappropriate comments. As he gets older, he may be able to learn to read, sound out, and pronounce words, but may not understand what he is reading. Usually, a difficulty with pragmatics is not diagnosed until a child is at least 4 to 5 years old, and sometimes it is not identified until years later. Children acquire a system of rules that enables them to construct and understand sentences. Most of the words have never produced or heard before. Children are creative in use of language. Nobody teaches grammatical rules to the children. Now we have here the parts of behaviorism that is connected to the mechanism of language acquisition. These are imitation, reinforcement, and analogy. Wherein the imitation is a big part of childhood. At every stage, we learn by watching, listening and doing, playing hours of repetitive games, repeating countless jokes to each other, and mimicking the words to songs. To name only a few ways that we imitate. We learn social rules by imitation, studying facial expressions and body language. And not surprisingly, a big part of language is actually learned by imitation. Well, before they know language, babies deliberately imitate facial expressions as well as the sounds, intonations, and volume of what they hear, learning the pitch and contour patterns of their native language well before they understand individual words. Once the child becomes a toddler who can say few words and who can understand many more, they really ramp up their efforts to imitate. Young children need to imitate the language they are hearing around them to help them understand how the components of language all fit together and to work out what it all means. Next, the reinforcement. Reinforcement refers to anything that increases the likelihood that a response will occur. It increases or strengthens the behavior. For example, reinforcement might involve presenting praise the reinforce immediately after a child puts away her toys. The response, by reinforcing the desired behavior with praise, the girl will be more likely to perform the same action again. There are two types of reinforcement, positive and negative. It can be difficult to tell the difference between the two. Also, negative reinforcement is often confused with punishment. Positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is a very powerful and effective tool to help shape and change behavior. Positive reinforcement works by presenting by a motivating item to the person after desired behavior is exhibited, making the behavior more likely to happen in the future. Negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is when a certain stimulus item is removed after a particular behavior is exhibited. The likelihood of the particular behavior occurring again in the future is increased because of removing or avoiding the negative stimuli. Negative reinforcement should not be thought of as a punishment procedure. With negative reinforcement, you are increasing a behavior, whereas with punishment, you are decreasing a behavior. Lastly, the analogy. Analogy involves the formation of sentences or phrases by using other sentences as samples. If a child hears the sentence, "I painted a red barn," he can say by analogy, "I painted a blue barn." Yet, if he hears the sentence, "I painted a barn red," he cannot say, "I saw a barn red." The analogy did not work this time, and this is not a sentence of English. That's all for today. Hope you learned something. Thank you and God bless.